Okay, you guys good?
Yep.
All
Yep.
right. Let's do this. Ready?
Awesome.
3, 2, 1.
Yo, welcome to the Bub and Bob Show. I'm Bub Coons, and back there, right there, is Bob Matosian. Bob, say hi.
Hey,
We got
how
him
you
on
doing?
camera now. Good to see you. I got a special guest today. This guy is amazing. He wrote a lot of books, and one I want to talk about today is so the next generation will know that he wrote with J. Warner Wallace. He got his master's in theology and philosophy. He's got a PhD in apologetics and worldview studies. Needless to say, he's very underqualified to be at this table with me. Untrue. This is the inimitable Sean McDowell. All right, welcome to the Bub and Bob Show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great. So tell me a little bit how you got, what you do and how you got into it. Tell me a little bit about your story.
Sure. So I started by teaching high school, apologetics, worldview, 17 years ago.
Wow.
Did that 10 years full time. And some of that was my own story, having a father who's an apologist, having a father who has just spent his life investing in the next generation. That rubbed off on me. Did it for 10 years, and about 5 years into it, thought, you know what? I don't know that I can just do high school 40 years. I mean,
How you did it for more than three
Well,
is incredible. But
I love it,
bless
but
you.
I mean,
Bless you, my friend.
just full time wasn't going to work for 40 years. So I went back, got a PhD, got hired at Biola, the graduate program in apologetics, but stayed on teaching 1 or 2 classes part time because I love it on top of teaching at Biola.
well, you stay pretty current with the Gen Z or whatever next generation. would be
Totally
because-
keeps it current.
Yeah.
This morning had a conversation. I have 11 students, and for an hour just talking about the problem of evil and dissecting
easy
that
stuff,
with students.
yeah.
But they come alive, and they want to make sense of this when you pose it in the right way and
Yeah.
make it interesting and relevant. So essentially right now what's interesting is I have 1 high school class, 1 undergrad class, and multiple graduate level classes.
Yeah.
So kind of the whole gamut.
So what
That's
got
what I
you
do.
into it? What's your story? Your faith story. I know your dad's famous, and he probably influenced a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
His dad's Josh McDowell. In case anyone's wondering, you grew up in that environment.
Yep.
What was it like? I mean, did you just agree with everything your dad and then walk right into faith and go? This is
It was that easy. Graduated from college. Somebody
Yeah.
said, I'll give you a book deal.
And
I'll
you
give you a
just did,
teaching
yeah.
job. And I just wrote it. I
Yeah.
mean, no, that's certainly not true.
So what's the truth?
I would say there's a few levels to this story. One is having a mom and dad on Campus Crusade for Christ, now Crew, 40, 50 years, seeing their passion, seeing what they do, seeing them live it out, make a difference, certainly rubbed off on me to a degree. My dad's an apologist, so
And what is that? Just for people.
essentially apologetics, 1 Peter 3:15 says, set apart Christ the Lord in your heart, always be ready with an answer for those who ask, give with gentleness and respect.
Right.
The word translated in English, answer, is apologia from the Greek,
Great.
apologetics.
Great.
So all apologetics is giving a reason why we believe the Bible is true.
And that's a
God
command
exists,
for all
etc.
believers,
It's
right?
all
Yeah,
believers.
all believers should
it's
be
not a
prepared.
spiritual gift.
Right,
Everybody's
right.
to have an answer.
Yep.
And so my father wrote books on this, and he would speak on this. So we'd have these kind of conversations, and it kind of interested me. It wasn't really my own, probably till I got to college. And there were a couple things. Number one, which is kind of a questioning period that I went through.
Yeah.
This is the mid-'90s, and I remember kind of first time I was surfing online, just started checking out different stuff and discovered that this kind of atheist secular web had begun, taking my dad's book chapter by chapter. And these are historians and philosophers and PhDs, like dissecting it. And as a 19-year-old, I didn't have the ability to respond to that. It was really unsettling to me. Now I look back at those arguments, I'm like, I can't believe I was taken by that, but that's because it's 2 decades plus later. At the time, it was really unsettling. So figuring out some of those answers, having a conversation with my dad, just saying, hey, I want to believe what's true, but I got to figure out if I really embrace this Christian thing, and him being loving and supporting along the way. So a lot of those questions and that experience in my life really motivated me to figure out, does this Christian worldview make sense? And then with a passion for students, I kind of figured out, I'm like, if you spend time with students, they have a lot of questions. They want to make sense of the world. So this passion for apologetics and philosophy and this interest in students kind of just whittled down, so to speak, to what I do today.
What was there something that your father did that was really helpful for you along the way? Did he just get scared and go, "Oh my God, what are you talking about? Get out of the house," or what did he do? When you had those questions?
So we were in Breckenridge, Colorado, up in the mountains, and I think it was my sophomore year, And we just sat down. I just said, hey, I want to know it's true, but I'm not sure that I'm totally convinced Christianity is true. I didn't reject it. I just said, I'm asking these tough questions. And he looks at me and goes, son, I think that's great.
Oh, wow, that's amazing.
And I was like, did I miss something? And like, I seriously thought, are you even hear what I'm saying? He's writing a talk in his head or something. He goes, look, you can't live on my convictions. You've got to know what you think is true. And I think if you seek truth, you'll be led to Jesus because he is the truth. Mm-hmm. He's like, don't rebel from what you've learned just to rebel. Follow what is true no matter what. And he goes, your mom and I will love you along the way. So that was reminiscent of the way he had raised me. It wasn't believe this, do this. It was conversational. It was relational. He'd ask me a ton of questions. So one of the best things he did growing up is when I asked him a question, he'd go, well, what do you think? Here's different options. And he would just help me think through things rather than just believe X, Y, and Z.
That's good. So how to think, not what to think necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, for the most part, that's how he would try to raise me and my sisters.
Yeah. So what when you had those questions, what were the major ones that when you were looking through and going, I don't know about this, and you saw those things from the atheist, what's the ones that stirred you up that went, I got some questions now?
I think the big one at that stage is I read this article on the historical Jesus that said there's nothing unique about the person of Jesus. The miracles, the resurrection, the teachings, and this article pointed to these older gods like Osiris, this Egyptian god, and Mithras, the Persian god, and on and on and on. I thought, oh my goodness, there's gods who were born December 25th. They had 12 disciples, born of a virgin, resurrected.
So it looked like the scriptures were borrowing from previous things when you read it.
They're these pagan myths.
Which wouldn't have disproved it, but it was enough for you to go, that's weird if that happened before and then we're copying it, so to speak. But
some of the people that make this argument ultimately argue Jesus didn't even exist.
Oh, okay.
And it's entirely mythology.
Wow.
Partly what it was is I had never even heard this before. It was never on my radar. I mean, in some ways, my faith was probably naive. I thought someone wasn't a believer because they just hadn't read my dad's book.
Right.
How hard is it? And then there's smart people pushing back, and I'm like, wow, this is not as easy as I thought. And it's pretty normal now that I work with students.
Right.
Things go from black and white to like gray, and you just got to figure out where you land. And that's kind of where I was at. And there was other issues related to, science and faith and evolution. There was questions tied to like the problem of evil and what if I was raised in a different faith? Like just a lot of these kinds of questions that I needed to make sense of.
Yeah. So you fast forward all the way to this time, and you're writing. You've written a few books, co-authored a few, and edited some even with your dad. The new one. So that you think the next generation will know with Jay Warner. Why did you guys write that, and what was the urgency behind that?
Well, one of the reasons are Scotty, Shauna, and Shane, which are my kids.
Okay.
I kind of entered into this season with the craziness and busyness of parenting, seeing a lot of shifts happening with Gen Z and my own kids, a lot brought on by a smartphone, and not finding the exact kind of resource that I would want to have in my hands for my own kids. That was partly what spurred it. And then thinking, well, I've got a unique platform here. I could write this book, and it was going to be a smaller niche book, more for youth pastors, how to practically teach worldview.
Okay.
So I went to Jay Warner, my co-author on this book, partly because he brings this cold case detective perspective. He's a former atheist. He just brings such a unique way of thinking outside the box. And I had heard him talk about this generation in a unique way. And he goes, this book needs to be bigger. Let's do it for parents. Let's make it a broader book for anyone that cares about this generation. And we kind of crafted it together.
Yeah. Yeah, and what's the main thrust behind it? What's the big goal behind the book?
Essentially, we're looking at Gen Z.
Yeah.
So there's one chapter 2, where we just flush out. I mean, I did tons of research on this generation, from working with students individually, but also top-down studies, helping people understand they're not millennials 2.0.
Right.
How does this generation think? How do they act? What do they believe? What do they expect? And then what's a practical way any caring adult can help pass on their faith to the next generation. That's the idea. So we kind of framed it like, we're not giving you a new program to do.
Right.
Because nobody's going to do that. They're busy. But what if we could help people open their eyes and more strategically see the opportunities that are already there and better use them to help your kids have a biblical worldview.
Right.
So it's tweaking certain things in people's minds. That's doable.
Yeah.
And frankly, when people start seeing it, it's like, wow, I never thought of it. That's rewarding, and that's a powerful way to influence my kids.
Yeah. So how much is the phone really influence? I mean, what's the difference between, let's say, your dad's generation, your generation, and your kids? I mean, in your research, what is like? Can you give us some specifics? So, well, this one they usually do this one usually does, but this one is completely new way.
Yeah,
How do
Jane Warner calls them digital natives, right?
Yes, that's
Yeah.
a term that's used
Right.
for Gen Z. That's right.
Yeah. So because I didn't grow up with it, and I
Yeah,
have a
me
different
neither.
childhood completely. But now
Totally.
I borrowed into it, and now it's part of my
So,
life. But
think about it broadly this way. Those of us born between the ubiquity of the smartphone learn how to communicate online. Those born with smartphones need to learn how to communicate offline.
No.
It is second nature to me to sit down and talk without a smartphone out. That's how I see the world. I want space without a smartphone.
Yeah.
This generation has never known what it's like to get lost because they can always
Right,
find a way.
right.
And they've never known what it's like to not be able to connect it to who they want, when they want, how they want. That's a big difference. So think about, I mean, you can flesh this out in so many ways. When I was a kid, I grew up in the mountains of San Diego. And we would, if I wanted a toy, it was like get the Sears robot
Yes,
calendar.
yes.
And there was maybe 4 or 5 options. And I waited a month to 6 weeks to get a toy.
even if you got it,
Even if you
even
got it, right?
yeah.
It was this painful, like in 6 weeks, checking my
Yeah.
calendar. Now you get through Amazon what you want. And if you're really antsy, have it delivered on a drone that afternoon.
on the same day.
Think about music. I would either have to go buy a CD and get all the songs if I
Right.
just wanted one, or I'd have to sit by the radio, wait for music to start, and then I hit record. I'm like, yes, I got this
and
song.
you get the half of it because you're always late
Well,
hitting record. That's what I was
exactly.
doing.
You would miss some, and the quality was lesser,
Yeah.
but you had it. So think about this generation. They can have, again, what they want, where they want, how they want it, with whom they want it. Music. I have the songs I want instantly
Yeah.
tailored to me. Products instantly tailored
Yeah.
to me. Think about sodas. I remember these commercials, Coke versus Pepsi.
Yeah.
And the idea was,
Coke
if you
won.
want a soda, there's really 2 options. Now you get your own fizz-making machine.
Yes.
The level of fizz, the size, the flavor, tailored for you. And if that's not enough, you can get a soda with your name on it. Right?
Yeah.
So the difference is, we don't think about what this teaches a generation.
Yeah, what does it do to
It
the mind?
teaches them that they can tailor the world to their interests and preferences rather than having to tailor their interests and preferences to an objective world outside of them. So no wonder we're seeing a generation that says, if I feel this way, it's true for me, and you're a bigot not to affirm it. Because everything else in their life is tailored exact to their wants and desires at the moment. So to me, that's the basic difference. And I approach this, when I talk about Gen Z, I'm careful to not blame them.
We're sure.
Because
or to say it's a negative thing
a
automatically.
lot of people are quick to criticize Gen Z or millennials.
Yeah.
We've all heard the jokes.
Right.
I'm not putting any blame here. I'm saying any generation raised with this technology and this way of thinking would naturally respond in this fashion because they don't have a perspective of not everything being tailored to their taste at that moment.
Right. So what does that do when we're talking about church or relationships or deep relationships? What can you teach a teacher, a parent, or a pastor about that generation and maybe open the door a little to share the gospel or to communicate better?
So here's one practical thing I think people can do, and you can take this different direction if
Sure.
you want to. Often what happens in conflicts across the generation is there's different expectations that are unstated and unknown, so it leads to conflict.
Right.
So for example, you and I sit down, the expectation is don't be on your phone. Like
Right.
that's obvious.
I'm right here. It's rude.
I wouldn't
Yeah,
have to
right.
tell you unless I'm like, oh, I got to show you this video.
Right.
We look at it together.
Right.
Or we're debating who
Look
scored
it
the
up.
most
Right.
points in history
Right.
of the NBA, which we all know, but something
Yeah.
like that, we look it up. But the most part is we connect together. That's not an assumption many Gen Zers have. Being on your phone is a part of the way. In fact, we might be liking the same post on Instagram or Snapchat while we're together.
Right.
That's not viewed as rude. So what happens is older generations have certain assumptions. Younger generations have other assumptions, and when they're unstated and boundaries aren't set, it leads to conflict, which is what I found with my kids in my classroom. If I state expectations and they're reasonable, and I explain why, then for the most part, I don't have issues. Now, I'm not a perfect parent. My kids push back and I make mistakes, and we work through this. But that's the principle a lot of people don't realize. They don't even think about the assumptions Gen Z brings to the table. Listen and try to understand. Many Gen Zers don't think of the assumptions older generations bring. So there's conflict and there's misunderstanding and everything breaks down. But if you bring it to the surface, like in my classroom with undergrads that are all Gen Zers, I said there's no laptops out. There's going to be no phones. This is a 3-hour class. I said, I'm not anti-technology, but I want you present. I want to see your eyes. We're going to discuss, work this through together. I said, now, if your mom's in the hospital and she's texting you, like, just let me know and I'll work with you. I don't want to die on that.
I'm looking at my phone because someone's saying something important.
Just tell me. That's fine. But when it's not stated, then it leads to problems. I haven't had a single issue from a student. They're like, oh, that's fine. And they buy into the class. So that's one way to better communicate is just have reasonable, clear boundaries and try to stick to it.
When it comes to parenting, though, and you got 3 kids, right? And they're all different kinds of ages. Do you hold policies about technology and the phones at home? What's a good parental tip?
We do have.
And I'm sure it's different for each one as they progress in age, right? Or maybe not. I don't know.
I get to speak and write on this, and a lot of this is just from mistakes that I make and I learn. I'm like, okay. So it's not like because I write a book, I've got this all figured out.
Right. So the third kid will turn out a lot better because you practice.
The third kid will be like, just do whatever because it all goes out the window. That's the way it works. But my philosophy, my son didn't get a phone until he was 14 and a half. What we said is, he's our oldest. The soonest you could get it would be 13. But that doesn't mean you get it at 13. That's what my parents said to me about my license. You can get it at 16 if you meet a certain qualification. And my dad's thinking was, I'm not going to give over certain power that I have in your life and say you necessarily get a car. Your grades, your character, etc. If that's in line, then I will trust you with a car. So I said it with the phone. I said, if you're 13, you got to have your grades up. There's certain responsibilities at home you need to take care of. And there's just certain character things we're looking for, the way you treat us and your siblings. Well, it didn't happen at 13, didn't happen at 13 and a half. He's a kid, he's in process. He made choices that ended up not getting the grades he needed. And these aren't totally unreasonable expectations. I thought they're reasonable and he agreed. Finally gets it at 14 and a half. We had him sign a contract with it.
Oh, so serious.
I actually wrote up 2 pages. And it's not that he loves it and thinks it's wonderful. But because there's a relationship, because we have laid these out and we tried to hold him accountable to these things with making appropriate exceptions, we are working through the process and he's seen certain things other kids don't see. So sometimes he'll say, "Guy, look at how much that guy's on his phone." Or look, my friends, I go to their house and they're just on the phone nonstop. Like he sees certain things other people wouldn't because we tried to help them process and value it in that way. So yes, we have boundaries and sometimes they're negotiable. But you know why I think parents don't?
I'd love to know.
I think parents don't because they don't want to fight the battles.
Really?
It's easier to just give your kid a phone and not be the only parent who's not giving in. It's easier to just give it to them and not worry about it. But what that does, it makes it a lot harder for the parents who are engaged and who are trying to do the right things.
Right. Well, and then, and this comes down to basic discipline, right? That's most parents don't want to discipline their kids because that's hard stuff.
It is hard.
It's really hard to be the one that always is correcting and always trying to discipline or disciple and go, I don't care what other parents are doing. It's my biblical mandate to raise my kids, and I gotta set boundaries. So you travel quite a lot. How often are you on the road, like talking and teaching and conferences and?
It's somewhat seasonal.
Yeah.
So this year, my son's playing varsity basketball as a sophomore. So I cleared out end of November, like through February, where I'm only doing a few local things. Right. Or I have 1 or 2 traveling things that I worked around his basketball schedule. So that season's pretty light.
Gotcha.
But between like September and November, probably 3 out of 4 weekends.
Yeah.
Now it might be out Friday, back Saturday. One weekend I go on Saturday morning, back Saturday night. Like I go as fast as I can.
Get there and get back.
While honoring my host. Right. But I don't know, maybe a quarter of the time to a third,
Yep.
I'm gone.
What are you seeing out there when you travel? What concerns you when you're running into these people, hearing the issues that are out there, or maybe not even when you travel, but just in culture itself? What, as a Christian and as a Christian parent and as an American, I mean, when you look at the landscape, what really concerns you?
There's a lot of directions we could take,
Yeah.
like what concerns me politically, morally. But I'll tell you,
Let's do all of them.
because I'm a professor
Yeah.
and I care about this generation. I think what increasingly concerns me is I think our church, adults and kids, are far more secular in terms of how they think than we even remotely realize. And I could give you an example of this. So I've had this conversation many times with students. I'll simply write up something like on the board, what does it mean to be truly free? And I'll say, I don't mean politically. What does it mean to be a human who experiences freedom? And the answer is always, you get to do what you want without restraint. As long as there's no law or person telling you what you want to do, you're free.
That's their answer.
That's
This
the answer
complete autonomy.
I always get from every
Wow.
Christian group students I've ever done. My follow-up question is, if there is a God, would this change the nature of freedom in any fashion? If so, how? The response comes back, freedom is doing what you want to do without any restraint, but now there's consequences.
Okay.
So all God adds to what it means to be free is consequences. Guilt in this life, maybe judgment in the next.
Wow.
So in other words, everybody I've ever asked on this has a secular view of freedom and just slaps God on top of me and consequences. Well, that makes a secular view much more appealing. If you can get rid of God, you don't have
Absolutely.
consequences. So then I won't walk through the way I lead this discussion, but I help them see that if there is a God who is a creator, just like a cup has been made to be used in a certain fashion, if we have been designed by God, then there's actually a way we are meant to live our lives, and we're only free when we align with that truth.
Right.
So they get negative freedom from, but no concept of positive freedom, which is freedom for something. So if God created us...
Explain the difference real quick.
Well, freedom from is a negative kind of freedom that nobody's locking you up, preventing you from doing what you want to do. So they got half of the equation somewhat correct to a degree, although I'd quibble with a part of it. But if you're in jail, you're not out free to do what you want.
Right.
But just because you're not in jail doesn't mean you're living a life that is free.
Right.
There's also freedom for, which is positive freedom. Okay. So the Bible starts and it says, in the beginning, God created. So the first thing we learn about God is a creator. If something's created, there's a purpose for it. There's a purpose for this microphone, purpose for my jacket, shoes, air conditioning, whatever it is, a cup. And when we know what something's made for and we use it accordingly, it's set free. So what are humans for? And one student's answer was, you're actually only free if you could live in a forest and nobody could prevent you from doing what you want to do because nobody's stopping you. I said, well, if we've been made to love God and love other people, you'd actually be the least free in a forest because humans are made for relationship.
That's great.
So this relates to all sorts of issues.
So freedom is directly related to what you're created for.
Exactly. It's like a cup.
Yeah.
It's made for a purpose.
Or
So
take a fish out of the water and it's made for water. You throw it up on the
There
sand,
you
it
go.
dies. It's useless. Yeah.
There
so
you go.
It's made for the water. It's
So-
only truly free in its boundaries, in a sense.
in its boundaries. So freedom is not
Purposeful
doing
boundaries.
whatever you want. Freedom is aligning your life to truth, aligning your
Reality,
life to reality. So in other words, I like to use the word, it's orienting your life to reality.
Right.
So take issues like the transgender debate.
Yeah.
Is freedom ignoring biological truth and doing what I feel like?
Yeah.
Or is freedom tied to living consistently with your design? Well, how you answer that question of freedom on that issue and others, is there a purpose for marriage? Is marriage just tied to whoever you love, whatever, regardless of gender or number? Or is there actually a design and purpose for marriage bigger than me?
Right.
And I'm only free when I align myself with it. So my point is, I think increasingly as I speak with people in the church, and rather than just give a talk, I ask questions and I unpack it. I think a lot bigger than we realize, people have adopted a secular way of thinking about the world without even realizing it.
And it causes havoc, not only personally, right? But there are also consequences there. I mean, you do add that part of the consequence to just how you're created in the moral law that God built. You're more free living in that boundary than people think they are until they actually do it. I think if you talk to some of these people who have done all these types of things, on the other side of it, they realize that those moral boundaries are actually what helps them love life and be free. And speaking of that, I know you and I worked on a PragerU video on the sex matters. So let's dig a little deeper into the whole gender identity and the thing that's going around. What's a Christian's response, a loving Christian's response to potentially dealing with a friend or a family member that is dealing with that, especially as if they don't see any wrong in it?
So a couple weekends ago, I was asked to speak at a huge church in Idaho on transgender ideology in church. So I'm not asked to speak on a lot. A lot of people just don't want to address it. And I walked through the difference in worldview between transgender ideology and between historic Christian faith. And then I built up like the last 15 minutes in talk. I said, what do we do? What's the response? And then I left it and I said, I think the response is obvious. All of you know this. And I let it sit so they're thinking, wait, do I know this or not? I said, the answer is obvious. It's love. The Christian response is love. So many times on LGBTQ issues, Christians are motivated by fear. We're afraid, what if my family member enters into a relationship and it messes things up? Or what about my religious freedom? What about, like, Christians operate by fear. Well, 1 John says, perfect love casts out fear. The Christian response is love. Now, where it gets difficult is, what does that actually look like? Does that mean going to a same-sex wedding or not going to a same-sex wedding? Well, that's a good one,
because love is this brilliant balance of truth and grace, right?
That's exactly what it is.
So I mean, the old way to do it, which I wouldn't even argue today, is it's always the gospel. The gospel is the center of all of it. But it's how do you bring that up when you have a family member or a friend who begins to dislocate from you and the family or the friendship because they automatically just think you're judging them. How do you go after that person, or do you let them go? Do you just try to have a conversation?
My response would be, if that happened, would be to shelve the issue that seems to divide us, find common ground, and just build that relationship. I mean, a gentle word turns away wrath, the scripture says. So I have a student I was working with a while ago that just probably took me a year and a half to kind of break through to this student to know, you know what, I really care about you. And finally, we're starting to see some common ground and conversations, and there's room for ministry. It just takes a while to get there. So in one sense, Jesus did let the rich young ruler walk away. You can't force somebody who's not spiritually open and who doesn't want to be in a relationship to be there. But I think it's a mistake sometimes to feel like I've got to make every conversation about Jesus.
Right.
Sometimes people know where you stand, and you just spend time with them, and you love them, and you care for them. And it's not just because I want to secretly win that person Jesus. I hope they become a believer. That person is made in the image of God, and I just am called to love my neighbor and love this person, as difficult as that may be. Right.
No, I would agree with that. But speaking on the topic of a little bit, you addressed not every conversation has to be about Jesus. When you have those conversations, how do you normally start? Let's say you're on a plane, or you're one of those guys that puts headphones on and just wants to be like, I'm kind of like that. So I need my 2 hours. I don't really want to. But if someone nudges me and go, "What are you reading?" I'll go, "Oh, I'm reading a Sean McDowell book." Which I've read them, a lot of them.
On a plane, come on.
Oh yeah, I read on a plane. Right. I read on my iPad. Open my iPad; it'll have your books on there. I do my research before, but I mean, how do you, Because you're
So here's my approach. I am an introvert. I'm outgoing. I like people, but I get my energy being alone.
Yeah,
So I spend a week at an event, and I get on a plane, and I'm wiped.
Yeah.
There's some times where I just put my headphones in.
Sure.
Sometimes I want to read, watch a movie. I just have nothing left
Yeah.
emotionally.
That's me almost every 3 hours.
So, every 3 hours
So I'm
anyway.
like, so if you go a week and that's amazing.
I don't feel that every single person I've got to pull the conversation to
Right.
Jesus. But I kind of gauge where people are at. Are they willing to have a good conversation? And if it's just, I want to talk about the weather, put my headphones in,
Yep.
that person's not interested. I'm not going to
Yep.
force something. But there's a lot of times where somebody will be open, ask questions, and for me it's somewhat easy. So what do you do?
Yeah.
And I just go,
Right.
well, I teach apologetics.
Yes,
What's
for-
that? And then you just start launching. It's
Right.
easy. So if a person's interested, I will stop what I'm doing and look for those kind of spiritual conversations. I also look to try to do things, and it's not that I always do this, but especially on a plane when you're traveling, there's so many people that are just, they're lost, they don't know what they're doing, can't get their baggage up, find their seat, and it's like second
They're frustrated.
nature to me.
Yeah.
So when people are walking down, I'm like, does that person need help with their bag? I'll go out of my way to ask them. I was sitting by a guy the other day, we had a middle seat open, and his feet, so I had a bag in my feet, he had one in his feet. I said,
The
hey, the
middle
middle one's
seater.
open, do you want to put your bag underneath the middle seat here?
Yeah.
And he's like, no, I don't want it. I said, okay, well, I'll put mine
Yeah.
there. But I was looking for a way to just
Sure.
open up a conversation. Is this helpful to you? And
Yeah.
it didn't lead anywhere. But I look for conversation. I kind of just start where people are at.
Mhm.
I tend to ask more questions than I do give definitive answers.
Yeah.
And I just listen and I try to understand and find a natural connection to the gospel or something spiritual. So I approach it kind of like my mentor, Greg Kokel, said, just put a stone in somebody's shoe.
Love Greg.
Like, for example, I'll sit next to a guy on a plane. He's probably 21, 22, and he was reading Camus' book, The Stranger, right next to me.
Yep.
So he kind of set it down for a second. I said, hey, I just got to ask. I was a philosophy major. What motivates you to read Camus? And he goes, well, I grew up in a Christian home, went to church, and I've just been starting to entertain other ideas. I said, well, tell me about your journey. And I just listen. I ask questions. What do you think about Camus? And I said, I'm a professor and teacher. I also grew up in a Christian home. Can I leave you with a thought? He goes, yes. I said, if you walk away from your faith, that's up to you. But I see a lot of people who walk away who, number one, don't really understand the gospel. So they're reacting against a bad experience. And number two, have never considered the powerful evidence that Jesus is who he is. If you walk away without understanding those two things, that's a shame. I think you owe it to yourself. Don't you agree? And he agreed. So he wasn't open to take it further, but I thought I could at least say, while you're in this middle zone, don't react if you had a bad experience.
Right.
Make sure you understand what Jesus really taught. Just go back and reread John with fresh eyes. And then maybe this little book, More Than a Carpenter, my dad wrote, helped him update. Have you considered this evidence at least as a part of your journey? So I don't know where the guy's at, never heard from him, but I just look to try to encourage people where they're at. And sometimes if someone's open, like they might be ready to hear the gospel, do it.
Yeah.
But I just try to ask questions and look for opportunities to advance the ball, put a stone in somebody's shoe for the most part.
Yeah, there was someone, I just heard someone talk, he said, use this acronym SALT, start the conversation, ask questions, listen, and then tell the story. And
That's great.
A lot of Christians get
I love it.
backwards, right? They just go in and tell the story and they kick you and then they kick you when you're down and then you're in. But that's evangelism's an interesting thing, I think, in the 21st century with the iPhone. What do you think of people trying to do that online? Is that the place to have arguments on Facebook and Twitter?
Wow.
It depends on.
I don't enter into a lot of Twitter conversations. I rarely respond when somebody's baiting me or it's negative.
Right.
It's almost never productive.
Yeah.
If I get a comment and it feels like that's a genuine question, I'll try to respond whether it's a Christian or not. But I don't want to, number one, waste my time.
Yeah.
And number two, it's just, it rarely is genuinely productive.
Yeah.
So there's a difference between like these kind of Twitter debates and having genuine forums where people have real conversations.
Absolutely.
I just don't spend a lot of time doing that, but I have friends and I know people who do.
Yeah.
And who do it well.
So their whole point is to get on there and do it well. It's part of their active ministry.
Sure,
is
that's
to
their
get
ministry. I think there's
that's pretty
absolutely a ministry there. If
Abs-
people
yeah.
do it well in the right fashion, no question about it.
Yeah. What are the big questions your students ask you? Let's start in high school and then go into the college world. What's are they asking anything new, or is it the same kinds of questions repackaged? I know there's a lot of emotional attachment to these things than there may have been in past generations, or at least seemingly. There's so much, you hear the anger more than you hear the point.
That's true.
Right? So a lot of people,
That's true.
like you were just talking about, maybe this guy's walking away, but there's been a bunch of stuff in the news with a few of prominent believers, quote unquote believers, that have walked away. They never say it's a fact. Well, I left because I investigated Jesus and it's not real. It's always an emotional, mostly sexually driven. Like I can't deal with God saying I can't have sex with anyone I want. It's like a moral issue. But are your kids actually struggling with any of this, or we're hearing in the news that is it way unbalanced and you're not getting a lot of that?
I think there can be a range of reasons why people suffer. There can be a moral dilemma. Sometimes it can be intellectual. The guy from Hillsong was like, it's all emotional, and I'm looking for answers. What about hell? What about Jesus? So there was an intellectual component, at least from what I understood about it. So part of it is identifying what's really the issue and what's going on.
Because he said something about even science is starting to put daggers into that, right?
He did. Yeah. That's somewhat of a, criticism of the church, not addressing those issues and being too emotional. I think there's an important balance.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier, said, what are the questions in high school moving into college?
Right.
And I think what's happened over the past few decades, and some of my perspective on this is conversations with my dad, who's spoken at 1,200 universities. In the 90s, he shifted to high school. Early 2000s, junior high, and even earlier. Why? Because the life questions people were asking in the 60s, 70s, and 80s in the university started to shift into high school and shift even younger.
Wow.
So it's gone the other direction. And some of that is, I think, because of smartphones and for
Google
other
and
reasons. But those life questions that you used to think were pivotal in college are now made long before. The big questions I get, at least the way I frame it, is there's timely questions and there's timeless questions. So a timeless question is the problem of evil. Probably Job, probably the oldest book in the Bible, arguably,
deals with that.
Is about suffering and evil. That's always been a question. It always will be a question. Now, it might manifest itself differently.
Right.
Well, climate, are we destroying the climate? This is evil. Or whatever current issue, even the border. People say it's evil to make it, it's evil not to make it. It's still tied to what's broken about the world. So it looks differently, but it's a timeless issue. I would say then there's timely issues that pop up. And one that is kind of timeless, but in particular is like, how can Jesus be the only way? Feels so exclusive.
Right.
Because one of the biggest virtues that speak to this generation is be inclusive.
Sure.
Don't leave anybody out.
The coexist stickers, everything on your car.
That idea.
Don't judge anyone.
Jesus being the only way was an issue back in the Roman Empire, but it's bubbled to the surface even more today in a timely fashion. I'd say questions that are huge, and the Gen Z research backs this up, are questions of science and faith. Now, they've always been a question, but in particular today, because of the historical Adam, because of evolution. Can you be a Christian, believe in evolution? Do I have to choose between science and faith?
Right.
These are big questions for young people. So really, I would say there's science and faith questions, there's moral kinds of questions like the problem of evil, and then there's these social questions. And then I hear a ton of questions about LGBTQ issues all the time.
Yeah.
I mean, those are forefront.
What are they asking? Is it real questions, or is it emotionally driven? Is it smoke screens, or is it all the above? But is it genuine?
Oh, I think it's all of the above.
Yeah.
I mean, I try to gauge when someone's asking me a question. The way I think about it is...
How do you do that? How do you discern between that stuff?
There's a difference between someone who's blowing smoke. I don't get that a lot. I think most people are sincere and ask questions. But the real question is, somebody's asking a question, what's really the question behind the question?
Right.
That's what I try to decipher. So somebody asks about the problem of evil. What they might really be asking is, why did my dad get cancer? Right. Somebody asks about hell. What they might be asking is, I don't know if I want to be a Christian or not, but my parents weren't Christians and they passed away. Yeah. If I become a Christian, are they eternally in hell? Like, that's often a question behind the question. And the way I figure this out is, I'll speak on, say, intelligent design, or I'll speak on some big cultural issue about Gen Z. And 90% of the questions are not ideological. They're not issues that aren't cultural. They're my brother, my coworker, my sister. It's personal and it's relational. So I'm a professor, so I think like 30,000 foot view.
Yeah.
I love ideas. That's the world I live in. That's not where most people are at.
Right.
So when somebody asks a question, I want to know, am I addressing the right question? What's the question behind the question? And I think the best way to do this is just to ask a few questions, and that helps you figure out, oh, I see where this person's coming from. So hopefully I scratch where they're really itching.
Is it easy to just say, well, why do you ask that? Is that the right kind of question, or do you probe differently? Because that's what I'd say. If someone says, why would God allow evil? I go, why are you asking?
So that's fair.
Yeah.
Here's the way I would do it. It's the same idea. If someone goes, why does God allow evil? My response, unless I'm in a debate or on radio somewhere, I'll say, of all the questions you could ask about God, why that one?
That's
so
good.
it's
That's
essentially
better than mine.
Well, it's just because I've thought about this a little bit. It's the same kind of question, maybe a little bit less direct, and helps them think, yeah, I could ask a lot of questions. Why I'm asking this one? Now, if the person says, well, I was watching Batman vs. Superman, and in that movie, the bad guy states a problem of evil, and I was thinking, how do you reconcile God's goodness? Then it's an intellectual question. If the person moves towards, my mom has cancer, I was bullied as a kid, etc., then it's a more emotional, personal question.
Do you find people ask that when there's fewer people around, or can people get bold and honest enough even in a bigger setting when that happens, and you do a Q&A?
I think people will ask it, but they won't ask the question behind the question.
It's vulnerable. Yeah,
it's kind of like the student who goes, hey, I've got a friend who's wrestling with this. I don't call him out, and I go, well, here's what I'd say to your friend. You just kind of know.
Yeah.
So I don't want to embarrass anybody in a group. So you got to be careful how you
Well, that's the
gauge
gentleness
this.
and respect part. And the thing that trumps everything is love. I remember Ravi Zacharias saying that, behind every question, there's a questioner, right? It's the same as you. What's the question behind the question? And that's a very pastoral, very loving Christian way to approach it, because you don't want to, unless you're, debating at some kind of academic level where you just have to get the points across, you're really dealing with a human being who's really asking deep, true, honest questions that you can enter right where they are with
think about this. I had a kid come up after me after a talk, high school kid, and he says, is homosexuality the worst unforgivable sin? Now, you think that's an academic question, or you think that's potentially a personal question?
Very personal for him or someone else, for sure.
It was very personal. I just said, that's a great question. Why don't we go talk? I'd love to know why this question is so important to you. It turns out he had never come out to anybody. Comes out to me crying on my shoulder. Like, it was, do I belong?
Right.
Does God love me?
Yeah.
That's the question behind the question. And I'm sure so many times I miss this and don't see it.
Sure.
But that's where I pray for wisdom and experience to say, am I addressing where people are at? Because one thing I know, an awful lot of people, when I just listen, go tell me your story, there's a lot of hurting people.
Yeah.
And we're good at putting on a facade.
No, that's for sure. I mean, I'm struggling with even how the church is, I wouldn't say most or even all, but a lot of churches that I visited or go online, the topics they tend to not deal with the heavy cultural issues like suicide, pornography, and the gender thing that's going on. How important is that for the church to get involved and talk about the topics of the day? And I'm sure you're dealing with those everywhere you go.
Oh yeah.
Is that, what's some advice you can give to local pastors, churches? Because I say get in there, start talking about this stuff. But
I always hesitate to give pastors advice because I'm not a pastor, and I think it's one of the hardest jobs on the planet. You deal with finances. You go to funerals, and you counsel, and you preach, and it's impossible.
Yeah.
So the churches that I think are genuinely making a difference in equipping people are those that do two things well. They are very intentionally relational, and they teach people how to live out their faith practically. So I would encourage pastors to deal with these difficult topics graciously, do their homework if they do it. I think sometimes it's easy to give simplistic answers.
Yep.
But one thing I know about Gen Z and millennials is that a superficial answer is sometimes worse than just saying, I don't even know what
Right.
we're supposed to do about the border here. I see both sides and I'm torn as a Christian, but let's approach it this way. Here's the best I can do. Okay, gosh, that person's honest
Yeah.
and they're trying to figure it out. That's more meaningful to this younger generation than, well, we just got to love the stranger.
Right.
Well, what does
Right.
that
Yeah, I don't-
mean?
yeah.
Like, how do we do that? How do I respect the law and still like?
Yeah.
So I would definitely encourage pastors. I was thrilled. This church I was at did a series called Elephant in the Room. They talked about climate change. They talked about race.
Yes.
And they asked me to speak on transgender.
Yeah.
And the pastor's bold. This is just the way he approaches things. And he's not afraid of the pushback, but he really wants to frame it as graciously and lovingly as he can. And when there's a topic he didn't feel comfortable talking, he brought me in to address it. So when I spoke, he goes, man, I'm sure glad you're talking about this, not me. I said, yeah, but I'm gone tonight.
Yeah.
You get to deal with it.
I just opened all this up.
I'm out
Yeah,
of here,
see
man.
ya.
You're the one who still gets
Yeah.
to deal with it. So I would gently encourage pastors to address these issues, enter into the messiness, not feel like they have to have it all figured out, and create a conversation, because our lack of talking about these issues, I think, communicates a lot.
Yes.
It communicates that our faith doesn't have anything to say to these issues. It communicates we're just here to kind of feel good, get a pat on the back, live our lives,
Right.
but we don't have to address these messy issues. I'd respect a pastor who brings up on immigration. We're going to have a panel for the service.
Yep.
Here's someone pro, here's someone con.
That's
And
interesting.
I'm going to ask you questions about this. And we're going to try to find some common ground as believers, understand where others are coming from. Now, you don't do that on the issue of abortion.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I'm not going to give a voice to pro-choice
Right.
because that's not biblical.
Right.
I'm not going to do that on the issue of same-sex marriage. Scripture is clear. But I would bring people up who have same-sex attraction.
Yeah.
What's your experience like? What can we do better? What does it mean to love you? Where are we missing things? How do singles flourish in our church? Like, just inviting these conversations gets messy. And I think sometimes pastors fear rightly, am I going to turn people away?
Yeah.
Like, I understand that fear, but my dad's philosophy was like, I'm going to attack hell with a squirt gun. And so, like, we have to talk about this stuff. Let's dive into it and not be afraid.
Yeah. You mentioned something that's dear to my heart about always working against and fighting against is abortion. And there are quote unquote Christians who argue for it. And I think it's a clear position in Scripture about what we do with born children and children in the womb. And but there are a lot of people that are moving in the direction of, I would say in parts of inside the church are moving toward there could be good and valid reasons, and we shouldn't bring that subject up. It's in a gray area. What's your thought on that? Or put it in more personal ways. Anyone in your schools that you teach ever come to you that was pregnant, or a guy that's what would you counsel them to do?
So there's a big difference between how I'm going to counsel somebody who's pregnant and needs love and care and to not be shamed and do the right thing when they find themselves in a situation they didn't plan. That's where the church needs to be loving. I was speaking at a church on Pro-Life Sunday maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and my son was at the door taking money, like people drop in coins. If you have loose change, drop it in this. We're giving it to the Praise Resource Center. The lady walks out and goes, man, I'm not giving money for this. They made a mistake. Why would we help them in their sin? My son tells me this.
Wow.
And I was like heartbroken. Like, how can you sit through this and not have compassion? What is the matter with you? Like, that's very different how we help people versus somebody who comes and says, God is okay and abortion is good.
Yeah.
That's a very different issue. And frankly, to be honest with you, I think that's demonic.
Yeah.
Because, well, what do demons do? They end and they kill and they snuff out life.
Yeah.
That's what abortion is. I am unequivocal on that. Scripture's clear.
Amen.
Science is clear. Now, I'm not going to question somebody's salvation. That's between them and between God.
Right.
but they're teaching something that is against what Scripture says. From conception, every human being has intrinsic dignity and value.
Amen. Like something more and more, I think. I love how you balance these things. There is someone who's in genuine need, and you're trying to reach a person, and then there's the idea itself that needs to be broken down and held captive and contended for, and we need to be able to discern those things, because every person that comes up to you is not looking for an academic response, and even every academic person coming up to you is not necessarily wanting just to talk about the academic thing. So we're all humans, and we're all fallen, and we all need the grace of God. It's just how to discern these things, balance these things, and talk to the person one-on-one, and it gets tough. What are you really passionate about today that you maybe weren't 10 years ago? Has there been a shift in the passion?
This probably isn't what you're looking for.
I don't.
But
he never knows what he's looking for. He's just throwing bait.
I'm just mesmerized by whatever people answer my questions. I'm very happy.
One of my biggest loves growing up is basketball.
Yep.
You obviously not know by looking at me. No one's ever said, you look like a basketball player. I played at Biola 4 years.
Okay.
Average college guard, just the Rudy, hard-working, love the game.
Yes.
That was me. I
You said
I
your
just
son
love
is
it.
playing varsity, though, as a sophomore?
He is. He actually played as a freshman. But the point being is, I've been thinking about this recently. I love the game of basketball. I would be up early in the morning playing. I'd stay after practice. My coach would have me lock it. I'd go down and actually unlock it, tell him it was locked, drive around the block, come back, come in and keep working. I loved the game. And this past year with my son playing, I enjoyed watching him play more than I ever did playing. And I can't believe I'm saying that. Like, anyone knows me is like, dude, you're over the top for basketball. There's something about the game I love. I still watch the NBA, I still watch college. And there's something about that joy as a parent that I wish so many people could experience. And it's true for my daughter, my younger son a different way, but it hit me this year because he loves the game. They won CIF. He played as a freshman. Wow. I mean, watching this was like, I could die and go to heaven. If you had told me 10 years ago, I would have thought, you're nuts. I'm still in my 30s. I can ball. Like, bring it on. Now I'm realizing I can't play like I used to. But watching this brings me more joy than even playing itself.
So obviously then your kids, that's what's really changed over 10 years and just kind of not living through them, but enjoying that they get to do the same thing even more than
I think that's what, now there's an issue that partly I thought of that because I'm updating a book called True Love Waits, this big rally that the church had.
Yep.
And in the 80s, my father led the Why Wait campaign, the first global campaign for sexual purity, abstinence. Morphed in 1993 to Why True Love Waits. And there's been a lot of pushback on this and criticism of this movement. Not so much what my dad did in the 80s, but the True Love Waits in the 90s and early 2000s, tied to I Kissed Dating Goodbye and Joshua Harris's book, etc. And I think a lot of that criticism is warranted. And I'm updating that curriculum with them, writing a book, and we're going to launch it next year. So I've been spending a ton of time looking back at what was the ethic of the 80s and 90s and 2000s, what was balanced, what wasn't balanced, what's biblical. How do we think about this issue of sexuality? And frankly, I've even seen in my own life, I'm like, God, that was probably not as balanced. I took that from somewhere else rather than Scripture.
Right.
So I've just been rethinking a lot of that in a different way than I would have, say, a decade ago.
When does that come out? When is there a
I'm going this afternoon to write chapter 4.
So you're getting
it's due in February. It'll come out about a year and plus from now.
All right. Give me two must reads, 2 books that influenced you or that you'd say, hey, as a Christian out there, or even as a non-Christian, got to read these 2 books, and then give me 2 people that really influenced you.
So I think books that we love tend to speak to us at a certain season in life. So a book for me in college I absolutely loved is called The Return of the Prodigal Son by Henry Nouwen, a Catholic priest who passed away, a decade plus ago. And he looks at the painting in the Hermitage of Rembrandt's A Prodigal Son. And he always viewed himself as the younger son, who is the rebel. And he's looking at this painting, reading the story, going, "Oh my goodness, I'm the older son."
Yeah.
It's not a father and the prodigal son. It's a father with two sons who are lost, but they're lost in different ways. One is lost in a kind of reckless living sin. The other's lost in self-righteousness. And when I read that book in college, it wrecked me because I was a good kid. I didn't drink, didn't smoke, didn't sleep around. Everybody patted me in the back. I read that and was like, oh my word. I am just as sinful, maybe more than the younger son because of my own self-righteousness. So I haven't gone back to that book in years, and I don't even know how I would read it today. It kind of goes in the back of my mind now and then, but at that stage, it's his experience, it's his story. And Henry Nouwen was teaching at Harvard or Yale and gave it up to go work with handicapped people. Like, his life was just so rich. That's just one of my favorite books of all time. Another one, totally opposite, is written by an agnostic, and this is the philosopher in me. It's called The Storytelling Animal. Jonathan Gottschall.
Okay.
And I just love this book because he's trying to explain why we tell stories. And I mean, we sat down, we told stories. There's something about human beings that we communicate through stories. And he tries to give this evolutionary explanation. At the end, he goes, really, it doesn't work. I don't know the answer. I'm reading it going, wow, we tell stories because we're a part of a story. And God is a person. And our lives are a story. This makes sense within the Christian worldview. So I've never talked to him. I'd love to at some point. But you might not even find that interesting. But I love that
books about
book.
storytelling, no matter what they are.
Because it's the philosophical question about our nature. Where does this come from? And that was just one of those light turn on moments for me. That I see how stories define us more than I ever did before I read that book, interestingly enough, from an agnostic. Well-written book. People that influence me, obviously my dad. I mean, I can't escape his influence, however I look at it, who he is. My dad is my hero, hands down, no question about it. Other people that have influenced me, I would say some of my coaches, like my coach at Biola. He's the 5th all-time winningest coach in college basketball history. On any level. He's got a PhD, 2 or 3 masters, one of the smartest people I know.
Amazing.
Not only taught me the game, but a lot of just life lessons.
What's his name?
His name is Dave Holmquist. He's been there 40 plus years. Just phenomenal coach, even better person. He was huge. Some people, like when I went through that question period I mentioned, people like J.P. Moreland and William Lane Craig. Ironically, when I had that question period, I didn't want to read my dad's stuff.
Of course. Leave him out of it for now.
I just need, you see these movies, it's like a mentor comes along and trains somebody, and, you're Mr. Miyagi or you're whoever it is.
It's never the parent.
Gandalf. It's always somebody else. And they said a lot of the same things in a more philosophical way. And I know God is sovereign, but I credit so much of my worldview and my thinking and my confidence in the faith to those two and people like Greg Koppel and others. So those are some people that have a huge influence on my life.
That's great. Okay, last thing here. You got, if you have one message to say and you have about a minute and a half to say it, what would you say? Look in that camera and just say it. Whatever's on your heart right now. To anybody, one last message in 1 minute.
I think my heartbeat is for the next generation. There's a generation of young people that are growing up, and they have more challenges just one click away on their smartphones, morally, emotionally, intellectually, than any generation. Depression is rising, stress is rising, loneliness is rising, and the secular worldview is quite clearly captivating even many kids in the church. If you're watching this and you're a believer, chances are there's people who stepped into your life and shaped you. The question is, which young person will you step into and influence their life? Because when it's all said and done, I think about my life. I'm not going to care what car I drove when I stand before God, how much money I had, Twitter followers. I'm going to think about the next generation and the way that I influence them. So my challenge would be your kids, your grandkids, kids in your community. In what way do you have a responsibility and can you give back and help shepherd their faith?
That's beautiful. Thanks for being on the Bub and Bob Show.
Happy to do it.
Have you.
Fantastic.
See you guys next time. Adios.